Hey guys, what's going on? East here. The other day I was perusing Twitter and I saw a really interesting discussion that was taking place, and it didn't really get a lot of light, so I wanted to make a quick video just kind of talk about the concept of 60 FPS fighting games and what that means going forward into the future. So first off, this whole discussion kind of came about because the people who make Samurai Spirits, they made an announcement that the Xbox Series X was going to allow the game to be played at 120 frames per second. So if you're a fighting game player, that immediately just, there's a bell that just goes off in your head. You're like, wait a second, fighting games are all rendered at 60 frames per second. So how did that like change the whole landscape, right? Well, there was a really good discussion again on Twitter, thanks to this guy right here, and based off of what I was reading, a little bit of research that I did, fighting games changing from a 60 FPS to 120 FPS or even higher is not actually a bad thing. In fact, it's pretty good, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those reasons. So, you probably have some questions first and foremost, like does the game run faster? What happens in lag? Just canceling and attacks and like buffers work differently. And I guess, what are some of the overall changes you can expect if you have a game that runs at 120 frames per second? So, like, first and foremost, by far and large, the biggest change you'll notice is that if you have a monitor that supports 120 frames per second, which is a 120 hertz monitor, the game's overall just going to look smoother and better. It's super easy math here. Where you had 1 frame of movement before, you have 2 frames now. So every second, you're having double the amount of animation that's actually happening. So the game just looks like so fluid. So regarding other questions like the buffers and lag and all that stuff, you probably have this inclination in your head that games right now run at 60 frames per second. And that's not exactly true. So just to give you an example, like Street Fighter 2 back in the day, 20, 30 years ago, whatever, that game, the logic for the game was actually running at 90 frames per second, whereas the rendering for the game was actually running at 60 frames per second. So already you can see there's a difference between the clock that measures the logic for the game, like buffering, canceling, all that stuff, as well as the clock that runs the rendering for the game, which is, the frames and the frame data that you're used to and accustomed to. Look, I don't know how fast, the logic for games are nowadays, but as a programmer, I have hope for the people actually making these games and that they're programmed well, and so that the clocks, if the rendering was at 120 frames per second, they can handle 120 frames per second, logic rendering. So if the game is programmed well, then you shouldn't really need to worry about, does my buffer not work, or does my cancel not work in this situation anymore, or do I have to like use different option selects? That really shouldn't be much of an issue, assuming the programmers are good people. Another topic I want to talk about is lag, and something that should be good news for everybody is that when we have 120 FPS fighting games on a 120 hertz monitor, you can expect your input lag to be reduced. Now, before the Sage Jam smoochers get in here, there's a difference between input lag and, internet connection lag. Now, input lag is when I press the button, how long does it take to render on the screen? Internet lag is how shitty is your internet versus how shitty is mine, or, whatever that discussion is. I don't really know. Now, the good news is that the processes that, determine, input lag and that sort of thing is part of like a pipeline that renders the graphics on the screen that kind of looks like this, right? So this is just the display. Now, this is only a small part of the overall latency that you have in a game, which looks something a little bit more like this. Now, under a 120 FPS fighting game, moving on a 120 hertz or plus monitor, this process right here gets reduced a little bit. This process right here, yeah, there we go. This process here gets reduced a little bit because the way the graphics pipeline works, that's a fancy term I'm going to use and pretend I know what it means, is that everything is counted in frames, not seconds or milliseconds. It's frames. So 10 frames on a 60 hertz monitor and 10 frames on a 120 hertz monitor are very different numbers, actually. So you can expect input lag to be reduced in this sense. Let's see here. Now, I can't say it'll be a, just divide the input lag by 2 because it's, twice the frame rate. But because there are other things that are at play here, you can expect some sort of reduction is what I'm trying to drive home. So even though there's a lot of good points here, there are some drawbacks. And the drawbacks, in my opinion, really aren't that bad. And I think there's a silver lining here that I think that the FGC could take advantage of. I'll just get into it. The biggest drawback is just plain and simple adaptability. At current, the 120 hertz monitor, a monitor that can support 120 FPS fighting game, is pretty expensive. It's gonna cost you quite a bit of money. And this coupled with the fact that like tournament organizers aren't the most wealthy demographic out there. As much as I wish they were just rolling in dough, it's not really the case. And expensive monitors means that it's really difficult to purchase that for an entire tournament venue. It's just hard if that tournament standard becomes 120 FPS and then tournament organizers can't even keep up, and so we have less tournaments overall. That's just a bad thing, right? A community that's based off of like grassroots events should not be excluding people because of the price of a high-end monitor. Another drawback is that, and this is not a big one, I think it's very small. There's only a small handful of games out there that have this problem, is that if your game natively has lag in it for whatever reason, on a 120 FPS monitor, things are going to be a little weird if you're running a tournament. So if you have a tournament where some monitors are 60 FPS and some monitors are 120 FPS, lag is counted in frames, and so things become a little wonky if you have one monitor with 120 frames per second support and one with 60 frames per second support. So it's really hard to keep tournament standards and hold up that tournament credibility if people are playing on different kinds of setups. So it can't be a thing where we'll have them for these events but not these events. It's got to be like a all or nothing sort of thing. And I think that that's kind of a silver lining. I mean, people are trying to figure out a way, how can we make tournament organizing more viable for the TOs? How can we inject money into the fighting game community so that people who are working hard, making content, building up the scene are rewarded? And this is one way. You get sponsors who are interested in supporting fighting game events. And again, I mean, it would be as simple as a donation to the actual monitors for the actual event. Super simple. I think that's a great silver lining, and it's a way to, again, inject a bit of money and marketing into fighting games that I think would help the scene grow. So I guess overall, while the FGC might not be able to immediately take advantage of 120 FPS games, I think it's definitely something that you should be excited about for the future. Shout outs to this guy here. What was it? WYDD. He does a ton of really cool and really interesting bits on fighting games in general, as far as the actual like hardware and software is concerned. You guys, take a look at his Twitter. He's a really good guy. You should follow him if you don't. While you're there, don't forget to follow me too. Hey, what's up? And I guess while we're plugging people, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, and yeah, that'd be super cool. I appreciate it. Games look better. There's less lag. A little bit more money in the fighting game communities. People get paid, which is always a good thing in my opinion. And yeah, people will get to watch better looking fighting games. Why not? All right, guys, that's gonna be it for me. I gotta go to bed. I'll catch you next time. Peace.